Hello! Yay! So, welcome everybody to another Pint Pint of Science Taos, sorry about it, online event. Today we have our second. I think you freeze, right? You freeze.
Yes, I had connection issues. So how far did we get?
It's fine. Okay, we just welcome everybody. Well, let me introduce our new host, Elena. Today, welcome, Elena. Yay!
Hi. Yeah, I'm Helena, and I'm a PhD student in psychology and neuroscience. And I just recently joined Pint of Science Netherlands. And today we're welcoming Fabian van den Berg. So Fabian started his PhD in developmental cognitive neuroscience at Maastricht University in 2016. And now he's nearly finished with his PhD and writing up his results. And we're very happy that today he can tell us something about his research, which is going to be all about the neuroscience behind number learning. So welcome, Fabian, and we're very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. I'm glad to give it.
Yeah. Cheers.
Cheers.
The bit of everything.
Okay, let me share.
In the meantime, I forgot to introduce myself. How rude. But yeah, Margarida, PhD student from Utrecht in the UMC. Welcome, Fabian, and let's start our talk.
Yes. All right. So my talk is about how we learn numbers, which is very broadly like the development of numerical cognition a bit. So numerical cognition, it's something that we can all do, and it kind of comes automatically. There's two ways that we extract quantities from our environment around us. So when you look around, you can see that certain things have like the color red, for example, and there's a certain shape to it and a texture. And another thing that we extract from a scene is also quantity. And we can do two things. We can either get the exact quantity, so we know exactly that there's like 2 or 3 bananas on a counter. But if there's more than 4-ish, then we can't get the exact quantity anymore. Then we either have to use what we call an algorithm, which is basically a fancy word of saying that we count things. So when there's 8 bananas, you can count them one by one, or you can do it really quickly by seeing that there's 4 plus 4, or like divided in 3s. I don't know what you want to do. But if there's many things, then counting is not going to work. If there's like a flock of birds in the sky, you can try and count them, but you're probably going to lose count. And then our estimation is like a total guess at that point. Then you kind of know like there's like approximately 50. So in this one, there's like approximately 50 dots, which isn't true. You shouldn't believe me because there's more than 50 in there. And what we see is that this is not a special thing. Like a lot of creatures can do this. So take for example, the lion, which was a very cool study that was done on wild lions in the Serengeti. And they took this pride of lions, and they put like audio all around them and played roars of foreign lions, of strangers. And lions are kind of territorial, so they will defend their territory, obviously. And what we can see is if there's a lion patrolling and it hears the roar of one other lion, it will get into some kind of defensive pose and it's ready to attack that other lion when it sees it. When we start playing more lion roars, so the roars of 2 lions or 3, then we see the behavior change. So then the lion gets a bit more cautious because it's like, okay, I'm here by myself, or there's just 2 of us, and the odds might not be in our favor. And sometimes they even saw that the lions went back and got some buddies to help defend the pride. But this only goes up until 3 or 4 again. After 4, the lions don't really know the difference anymore. Like if there's either 7 other lions or 8, it doesn't really matter. You're gonna have to like get your buddies together and fight either way. But it does show that they know the difference between exactly 1 and 2. And it's not just in lions either. We can see this in really tiny mosquito fish. We can see it in birds and in primates. They did a very similar studies in chimpanzees as well. So we can see that a lot of creatures can estimate quantities, and they can also have exact representations, just like us. And that is very similar among species. But well, humans were a bit special because we want to do more stuff. And like the estimate of 50 dots when it's actually 68, that doesn't really help you build pyramids or land rovers on Mars. You actually need to know the exact number, because in a lot of cases, a difference of 1 is very important, like on paychecks, for example. So we figured out a very cool thing. We started just writing stuff down. We figured out that if we make these squiggly lines, and we all agree that these squiggly lines mean something, that we can communicate numbers. So in this case, we're communicating a 4. But these symbols are completely arbitrary. And all of these symbols mean the same thing. They all mean 4 things. It can be either money or whatever you're selling to the other city. It doesn't really matter, but it just means 4 things. And that doesn't come naturally. We have to teach ourselves that, or more or less we have to teach our kids that. And that's very difficult. It's tricky to go from this abstract sense of what a quantity is, because you can't really say it, to a symbolic representation. That process, it's called mapping, and it's supposedly what kids do when they're very young, like around 2 to 3 years old, where they have to figure out that a non-symbolic representation, such as dots or cats or melons or bananas, that is the same as one of these squiggly lines. And that's also the topic of what I'm specifically researching. It's how they actually do this. Like, how does it work where they go from this non-symbolic representation, the stuff that we can do naturally, what we're born with, to this kind of unnatural ability of us using symbols.
Can I ask something, just very quickly? Just a curiosity, because you were talking about animals like lions, and you also mentioned that other animals also are known to kind of count. So is this evolutionary advantage related to each other, or how? I don't know. How does it work?
They're not really sure if it's either something that evolved very early on, or if it's convergent evolution, because we find it in so many species. For example, the difference, like birds can do it. We have stuff on crows, for example, that understand quantity information. So not necessarily that they're counting, but they understand quantity. And even bees can do it. We've even trained bees to actually do math. So they all use
quite cool
systems. What?
That's quite cool. If the bees if you can teach bees to count, because what I had in mind was, for instance, as human, we can teach our kids to count, but I guess animals don't do that, right? So they don't teach their I don't know, their other animals to count, I guess.
No, and in the case with the bees, we actually had to teach them what to do, and even then there's still a question, like, are they actually doing it, or like, it's a thing. But, yeah.
I actually also have a short question now that we're already at questions. So, because you mentioned before that 4 is kind of the number where it changes, also in animals. So is 4 like the magic number where everything switches, or is it more of a range of numbers?
That's also, we're not really sure about it. There's a lot of debate still going on, since it's the research into this is still kind of up and coming. Like, there was a lot of stuff being done, and now we're disproving a lot of stuff that's being done. But what they're thinking is that the way we have this exact representation of 1, 2, 3, and maybe 4, that is a completely different system that we also use for other stuff, because the brain really likes to repurpose and use the same mechanism for other things. So that it's more of a limit of our attention span rather than a numerical ability, that we can represent 4 things in our mind and track them through time and space. But more than 4 or more than 3, we don't really know for sure. It's just too much for a brain to handle.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, where was I? So, yeah, so we have to teach kids about these numbers, and they usually start learning it around 2 to 3 years old. When you're working with kids, there's not really exact age ranges, so it varies a lot. And the funny thing is that kids, it's gonna sound weird, but kids can count before they know how much things are. It's a stage where they're called a pre-knower, where they know the words, so they know 1, 2, 3, usually up until 10, and they can count, they can recite the list, and then after 10, it's like 11, 12, 14, 26, it kind of goes off the rails. At this stage, they know the words, but they don't know what the words mean. It's a very short window, but then they're in the pre-knower stage. And what happens is that in a span of 1 to 1.5 years, they start learning what those words actually mean. And it goes like one at a time at first. So then they become what's called a one-knower. That's when they understand what 1 means. So if you ask them, like, give me 1 stuffed animal, they will give you 1 stuffed animal because they know what you mean. And if you ask them, give me 2 stuffed animals, you're just going to get a random number, or they're just going to look at you and wait for some kind of sign that they're done. It's not even going to be close to 1. They don't understand that it has to be somehow close to 1 because 2 comes after 1. It's completely foreign to them. And like a couple months later, they will understand 2. A couple months after that, they will understand what 3 is. And the same thing happens in each time. You will ask them for 3 stuffed animals, you get exactly 3. Ask them for more, they don't know. You just get a random number. And around 4, so you see some kids, they do this up until 3, and there are kids that go up until 5. So again, there's a lot of variations when you're working with kids. Then they become what's known as a cardinal principle knower, which means that they know that, for example, 4 means that this set of items, that is 4 things. And that's the cardinal principle. So then they something kind of clicks in their head, and then they kind of realize that all the other words they know also mean something. So then they also know up until 10 and up until all the words they know. And then they can, if you ask them for 8 stuffed animals, they will know that they have to count up until 8, and they give you 8 stuffed animals. So that's a
Fabian?
Yeah.
Guillermo, our person in the background today, actually had a question for you. So he was asking if the concept of 0 is more difficult than other numbers.
Yes. So we see that it takes a while. So 1 through 10 is first. So integers go first, which is whole numbers. Concept of 0 comes then. We see that things like decades, so 10, 20, 30s, is a separate thing. Negative numbers comes after that, and around, like right before puberty-ish, they start to also understand fractions. So there's all separate things which we don't really think about. But yes, the concept of 0 is a very odd thing also in nature. And once again, bees, they understand 0, which is really cool.
These bees.
Bees are awesome.
Yeah, but how do you, I don't know if you know, but just on top of my head, how can you study that? How can you realize that bees actually understand how many stuff they have around them? I don't know, how many flowers, whatever.
Well, it has to be under very controlled conditions where they kind of make bees go through a maze, which is like they have to go either left or right. And if they pick the right one, which is less than or more than some kind of number, then they get like some honey or something. And if they go to the wrong side, they get something they don't like. So that's how they know that if they go to the correct direction more than 50% of the time, that they understand the concept. And you can do that with, like that's how they figured out that they can sort of do addition and subtraction, and also with the concept of 0.
Funny.
Yeah. Cool.
So you can also educate them.
Yeah, a little bit, but like bees aren't really great students.
No, I don't think so. It's funny. Okay.
Cool. So yeah, there were like 2 big ideas on how kids actually figure out what it means. The first one that was suggested a couple of decades ago was that it's all about this estimation that I talked about before, and that we connect these words or these symbols to this estimation. Like the brain kind of knows how much something is, so we connect it to that.
Can I ask something?
Yeah.
Sorry, just looking at it, and for me, it feels a bit abstract. But what does these waves? So you have this pyramid with the the dots, with the colors, and then you have like waves. So what does these waves mean?
So in this one, this is what I was talking about. This is like an estimation. So let's take the middle one, that's the easiest, which is 3 dots. And the brain kind of estimates that. And 3 is here at the top. So that's like the brain's best guess. But the ones next to it, like for 2 and for 4, they're also like a little bit activated. That's the idea of estimation. So it's not an exact one. So it's kind of like a curve over multiple numbers. But the highest one is above 3, and that's the one that the brain picks. Like, okay, this score is the highest, so we're going to say it's 3.
And yeah. I was wondering how this relates to the brain. So this is, I don't know, is this random numbers or?
If we're going to relate this to the brain, they found that your brain actually has specific number neurons for it that respond to a specific number. So in your brain, you have a neuron or a group of neurons that have the highest activation when you see 3 things, for example. So that's when they just go crazy. When you see 2 or 4 things, they're like, close enough. So they won't go crazy, but they will still send a few signals. If you then see like 9 things, they don't care about that.
Yeah,
so
cool.
It also relates to actual brain stuff.
So if you, yeah, sorry. Now I just was wondering about calculation, because I guess also if you try to do calculations like by head, I don't know, without using a calculator, of course, then probably it's an explosion of a bit of everything, because that's why you really have to stop and think about it. But I don't know if that is or not related to this talk, or if you are going to talk about calculation.
There's even if it's not just calculations, even if you're just comparing 2 numbers. So if you're comparing a 3 and a 4, it's harder than comparing a 3 and a 9, because these neurons are closer together. So you have like this overlap between them. So then you have 2 groups of neurons going crazy, and then your brain doesn't know which one to pick. But if it's like 3 and 9, those groups are kind of further apart. So then your brain is like, okay, it's 3 and 9.
Well, that's good to know, because I had no idea. That's funny, actually.
So yeah, that's where they based this initial theory on. They said, okay, we have these neurons in our brains. We have this idea, this sort of estimation of what it is, and we just slap a symbol on it, and that's how we learn it. But well, obviously that didn't pan out because we have some newer theories. And this one is based on what I told before about how kids learn symbols one by one, and then suddenly they know a lot of them. Here they say, well, they use this exact representation. So here we have like a green dot, so you know it's one thing. And here we have 2 dots, so you know it's a red dot and a green dot. So you know it's 2 things. And they say, well, that's what kids use. And they kind of connect the symbol to that. But when it comes to like 4 or 5-ish, we can't do this anymore. So there's no way to connect the symbol to what's called a non-symbolic representation, because our brain cannot figure out how much it is exactly. So what they say is, well, we do it for the first 3 or 4, and after that, we kind of rely on the connections between the symbols. So we know that 7 is 7 things because it comes after 6 and after 5. So we know that it's 1 more than 6 and it's 1 less than 8. And we don't really relate it back to any kind of real life quantity anymore. We just do that for the first 3 or 4. So we looked into this because a lot of this is done, like these experiments, a lot of it is done with behavior and stuff. So we figured, like, can we somehow measure this mapping process? So can we see in the brain what happens when we connect some kind of numerical information with a new symbol? So we did this with adults, and over 3 sessions in 2 days, we kind of taught them these symbols. So these are 9 symbols. We don't do the 5 because it's like in the middle and we use it for a different task, and we wanted to separate the smaller ones from the bigger ones. So what we did, we showed them some random dots. So each time the configuration was also different. And it was just a number of dots, like 1 through 9. And it was really quick, like half a second, which is not enough to count, which is the same way as kids. Kids, before they know the numbers, they cannot count. So we prevented the adults from counting as well. After that, we showed them a new symbol, and we just asked them, like, was the symbol the same as the quantity you saw? And then you had to press the button, yes or no. And if they had it right, they saw a green square, and if they had it wrong, they saw a red square. And obviously in the beginning, it's like 50-50 because you don't know what all the symbols mean. But over time, we saw that they actually learned based on the feedback. They actually learned what the symbols meant. But obviously there was a difference.
But Fabian, so basically you made the adults feel like children because you restricted the time that they had to count. Well, they couldn't count, so they just had to really quickly look at the dots. So they weren't able to count them. Exactly.
So we tried to simulate the same kind of circumstances that kids would have, like no ability to count. You have no idea what all these symbols mean. You've never seen them before. So we just wanted to see if it's possible to learn new symbols just on pure quantity information alone, nothing else.
And why did you decide to start with adults and not directly with children?
Mostly it's practical. Because kids, it's really hard to study kids because you have to have permission of the parents, and there's a lot of ethical considerations you have to do. And we were also measuring brain patterns, so that's another thing you have to do. And sometimes EEG can hurt a little bit, and kids don't necessarily sit still the whole time. So there's a lot of methods involved. Mm-hmm. Plus, this was like a new thing, so we weren't really sure if it's going to work or not. And you don't want to try out things that might not work on kids. So we did this first in adults to see what would happen, to see if we might need to change something, and actually to just figure out what we're actually looking for. Mm-hmm. And once we know that, we can do it on kids.
Cool, thanks.
So what we saw is that with the small numbers, so the first 4 in this case, the adults were able to just see the dots and know how much it was. Like, you don't need to count them, you could just see it's 3 dots. And we saw that they were able to learn these symbols. So they were faster and more accurate with these symbols. With the higher symbols, like 6 through 9, they still got a bit faster and more accurate at them, but all at the same time. Whereas in the 1 through 4, they kind of improved one by one. So 1 first, then 2, then 3, then 4. But in the high range, they kind of like all went up and down together, which we kind of concluded or saw as them getting like more of a generic label as, okay, this symbol, it's a high one. They don't know if it's a 7 or an 8. It's just one that's bigger than 5, probably. So what we kind of figured was that, okay, so you do need this exact knowledge, like you need to know that it's exactly 3 to connect it to some kind of symbol. And like our estimate, it's just not good enough. We then went on to look at the brain. The brain is really cool. And if we measure the brain, we can actually see what causes this behavior. So we saw that they got faster, they got more accurate, and we assume that they learned these symbols. But the brain allows us to actually see what's going on. We can separate different processes, is what they call, on a millisecond level with EEG. And we're looking at a wave just like this. So we showed these adults a lot of these trials. So they saw dots and then they saw symbols. And then after each symbol, we kind of cut out this little piece of brain signal. And we do this many, many times. And that kind of filters out all the brain noise, because there's a lot of noise in the brain. And kind of left with like a nice little wave. And each of these little dips and peaks means a different thing. And what it means, it depends on a lot of things. It depends on what you're showing them and what the task was. In this case, we're looking at this little dip. It's called the N1, which is called the N1 because it's the first negativity. They're at like around 100 milliseconds. They're not very creative. And in this case, we know that the N1 becomes less negative if we see things over and over again. But if we suddenly see something nice, something different, it becomes more negative. So it's yeah.
Sorry, can I ask something? So just to kind of try to make a kind of a comparison or so with this graphic. So if we see a peak goes up, it's because our brain, like the cells in our brain, like it gets excited. And if it gets a drop, then they're not so excited. Is that what you mean? Or
so what this is, so real quick, basic of EEG, like you have this gap on, and each tiny electrode measures the very minute electricity on your scalp. And what this shows is we take the reference, usually behind the ears, where there's nothing going on because there's bone. And then we compare this signal to the rest of the brain. So what we see here, so let's say we take the electrode that's like right here at the back of the head, compared to the average of all the other ones, this one is more negative than the rest of the brain.
So it's always about a comparison, basically, between brain activity where like it's a baseline or nothing is really happening versus something is happening. So then what you see is either more negative or more positive than what's happening there. But it doesn't, so negative doesn't mean less brain activity in that sense.
Exactly.
Okay. And about like the location of the dots, like the, I don't know, like the, I guess electrodes or so around the head, does it's there like a specific function, like, or I don't know, because I always see this kind of head with the dots, and then I always wonder when I saw in the movies, because I have no clue, what does this mean? Why is this all around? Does it's like specific parts of the brain because you really want to see something specific? No idea.
Yeah.
Here.
So yeah, there's a couple of standards that they have, but usually they're divided, like the difference or the location between them is about equal, and it's all covering more or less the entire brain, and you can sort of say that something is happening in a specific area of the brain, so that it's either like in the back or in the front. But with EEG, we're not really that good at saying where exactly in the brain it happens, because when let's say the electricity of the neurons, it kind of radiates out before it hits the scalp. So then it's really hard to figure out where it actually came from, because it can be a very small signal that's very close to the brain or to the scalp, or it can be a very big signal that's very deep. So with EEG, we can see stuff happening at a very quick succession at millisecond level, but we're really bad at location. But we usually combine it with MRI, and then kind of figure out, okay, that's probably where it comes from.
You said MRI. What is it exactly? It's
MRI is when we make scans of the brains. So when we put people in loud machines and then scan the brain.
So it's just like a photo of the brain or so.
Yes.
And then you match. Okay, great. Continue. It's fine. Thanks.
So a lot of my work was looking at line graphs, I guess, and I was looking at these two specifically. So this dip and this little peak. So this N1 we figured out was more like a surprise, and this one, which is called the P2P. This one, also in previous study, is the one that they kind of connected to numerical meaning. It's something that happens when we see something numerical, if we need to do something with quantities. But also a bit more general, it kind of means that the more positive it is, so the higher this peak is, the more cognitive effort we need. So we need to pay more attention, for example, or think a bit harder to do whatever we're trying to do. So this little peak, let's say it's associated with access to numerical effort, and the higher it is, the more effort we need. And this little one, the N1, it's connected to surprise. So what we saw when we combine it with our task, so we looked at the brain signal as soon as they saw a new symbol, we first saw this N1 thing, and it became more negative based on the dots that they saw way before, which is kind of weird because we were measuring from the symbol. So it took us a while to figure out what was going on, but it turns out that what happened was something called violation of expectation. So what happened is that they, for example, saw 3 dots, and they know it's 3 dots. So you see it and you know, okay, it's 3. Then you expect to see the symbol that belongs to 3. You expect to see, for example, this symbol, or to be more precise, this symbol. But then you see something else. So maybe you see the symbol that's connected to 2, so one that you know, or you see a symbol that you don't know. Either way, it's the wrong symbol. And then suddenly this N1 became more negative because they were like, hey, wait, that's not what I expected. So that told us that they knew the symbol, or they knew the symbol that was connected to 3, because you cannot make an expectation of a symbol you don't know. And they could only do that for the smaller dots. When it was a lot of dots, they didn't do it. It didn't happen because they couldn't make some kind of expectation. So it didn't matter if the symbol that came afterwards matched these dots or not. If it was something they knew or not, didn't matter because they had no kind of expectation. So that was the first way that we could use the brain to see, hey, they actually learned these numbers because they made an expectation. The second little peak that I showed, this one that was connected to numerical access, that one also responded, but it responded to the symbols. So that one became less positive. So it took less effort whenever it was a symbol that they knew. So this one only responded to symbols in this smaller range, so the first 4. When it was one of these symbols in the last 4, they were still like nothing changed between the first session and the last session. So from that, we kind of concluded like, okay, so this one also tells us that they learned these 4 because it's less effort, they're accessing the numerical meaning, but not these 4. So nothing happened there. So both of these, together with the behavior, told us that this one is probably wrong. We're not connecting the symbols to our estimation, because then we would expect them to learn all of the symbols. And it's more likely that it's connected to this one. So purely on quantity alone, it's only possible to learn the first 3 or 4. And because our symbols didn't have anything connecting to them, there were no words, the people didn't know anything about them, they couldn't figure out what all the other symbols meant. So that's the first part of my PhD that we looked at, where we determined, okay, so we have to look at all of these small numbers, because those are very important to actually lay the foundations of our numerical knowledge. But then again, learning numbers is very difficult, especially if you're 2 years old. So maybe there's something that might help, a little support that's readily available to everyone around the world, and that's our hands. So this is the second part of also my PhD, where we're looking at how our hands might help with processing numbers and learning numbers. So representing...
Yeah, I'm laughing because I found myself sometimes just counting like with my fingers, especially if I want to count hours or just to count even the days of the week. Oh, wait, and then I just use the finger. So that's actually funny too, that you study that part. I don't know, which is a realization. Go on.
Everyone does it. Like using your hands, it's something that happens all over the world. They found it in Western cultures and Eastern cultures. Even if you go to a remote tribe somewhere in the middle of the jungle, they're using hands, or in some cases their entire bodies, to represent numbers or quantities. The thing is that these, if you just focus on the hands, the way we show a number with our hands, it's different per culture. So you can hold up your fingers in a specific way to show a 3, for example. Think about ordering a beer in a loud cafe and you can't really talk, so you have to show how many you want. And some people will do it like this. Some people will do it like this. You have people who do it like this. This is usually also the part where I lose the audience for a minute, because everyone's like now thinking like, how do I do that?
I think I do this.
I think I do like this, I think.
Really?
Yeah, I do like this. I don't know. I think so, like this.
We all have our own way, or like our cultural way of showing these numbers. We also have a different way of counting numbers. But I focus mostly on showing numbers because that's also easier to show on a screen. So the ones that we know, those are also known as canonical representations. So that's the one that we recognize right away, and the ones that we use automatically without thinking. And all the other ones, those are called non-canonical. So your neighbor might show numbers like the 3 like this, you show it like this. So this way kind of feels odd to you, kind of feels off. But you can go even weirder and do it like this. And we call those non-canonical. So what we saw, or what other people already found, was that these canonical ones, we see them right away, and we're faster and more accurate in responding to those. And when we see the ones that are kind of off, the non-canonical ones, we need to either count them or sort of estimate them to know how many it is. I mean, it's not a lot of fingers, so we're still pretty fast at it, but it's slightly slower than this one. So what we wanted to know is like, what's the difference then? What happens between the brain, in the brain, and between these canonical ones and these non-canonical ones? So we did a similar task, again with EEG, and also with adults, because this was a brand new task that we came up with. And In this case, we showed them a very simple math problem, the one that you, like 1 + 2, like everyone can do it really quickly. You don't need that much time. And then afterwards, we show them these hands, and they have to tell us if this is the correct answer or not. So then they would have to say yes or no, this is the correct answer. And we show them either with canonical fingers or with completely weird ones that are non-canonical for most of the people that we tested. There's very few people here in the Netherlands that show like numbers like this. Again, we use the brain, slightly different curve this time because we're looking at different things because it's a different task. But again, it can tell us why the canonical hands might be faster and more accurate than the non-canonical hands. So this time we're looking at which is called the P2. It's very similar to the other one we had, but this time it means something completely different. Fun thing about EEG. Here it represents memory process such as recognition. And we saw that this little peak was higher for the canonical patterns. Which means that when we see that hand, it kind of triggers a memory in us that's stored in our long-term memory, and we can see it right away. And that is also what was speculated about why the hands were faster and more accurate, because we've been taught these symbols these hand patterns when we were really young, and we've been using them all of our lives, and they're just automatic, and it's just been like etched into your memory. So as soon as you see them, you know exactly how much it is. Whereas with the non-canonical ones, we kind of have to use our number systems to figure out what someone means. Like, how many fingers are you holding up? So that's what this little peak tells us, that yes, there is something going on, something special going on with these hands because they're stored in long-term memory. Then we have this second peak, it's a little bit bigger. This one's also closer to when people actually have to make a decision, like, is this the correct answer or not? And it's also associated with making a decision. And it's also associated with response confidence. It's a bit of again, a debate in neuroscience what it actually means, but a lot of people say it's response confidence. This one is also higher for the canonical patterns. So when we showed them the hand that they knew, they were more confident, they were more sure about what the hand actually meant than the non-canonical one, which again, probably because it was stored in their brains. So what this means is that the canonical hands have this really strong connection to their number meaning. So when someone shows you the 3 like this, it has a much stronger connection to the concept of 3 than when someone does it like this. Then you have different connections there. And we're also more confident about what they mean. So at first, people thought that, well, then canonical hands might just be symbolic. They're just like the squiggly lines that we use. But we kind of disagree with that. Like the patterns that we see in the brain, they don't really match up with symbols. Instead, what we're thinking is that these hand symbols are more iconic or ideographic. And ideographic, that means that like an ideograph is a representation of an idea. And you could compare it to like an emoji. If you send someone like an emoji, it's completely independent of language, but you still kind of both mean what it means. And we're assuming that canonical hands kind of mean the same thing. We can see them, we know what they mean, but we only use them for communication purpose. Nobody's doing actual complicated math using their hands and doing 3 plus, like, we don't really use it that much. That's what our symbols are for. But then do those hands actually help? We saw that when we combine these canonical hands with a number, that people are faster than when it's a non-canonical hand. So it seems that they can facilitate symbolic processing, so they can help you figure out what the symbol means if they show the same meaning. So it might actually be good that kids are using their hands when they're figuring out what numbers mean and when they're figuring out math in school, because it actually helps them connect the quantity to the symbol. Because in kids, it's still all very abstract and very loose, while in by the time we're adults, everything's kind of interconnected and in a whole numerical system. But kids are still struggling with that a bit. So we really need to learn more about how hands are involved in numerical learning and maybe education as well. And there's a lot of things that we still need to research. And it will require some really fancy studies, really expensive studies with kids that are very young. But that's all for like future work. So we're not going to do that.
Can I ask now? I have been wondering the whole presentation. So what's actually what's the application of these findings? I don't know, in our daily life. It's some kind of, I don't know if there's some kids that maybe have more struggle to for the number learning process. If you can help them with So yeah.
So as you might be able to tell, it's still kind of very fundamental work. We're still kind of figuring out where we need to look. So some of the things that we found were also the first time that we found them. So it does give us the tools for future research as well to figure out what we're actually looking at. So now that we found these brain results, for example, with the hands and with the symbols, we know that something changes, we know where to look. So now we can use that to investigate the same things in kids. And eventually also kind of figure out, like, if you know how kids learn numbers, you can also see when something goes wrong, where does it go wrong? And can you help them learn the numbers better? And also see, like, for example, some kids are really bad at learning numbers. Like, why are they worse than their peers? Like, is it something that's due to something in the brain? Like, is it something they're born with, or is it just something that maybe they're not practicing enough at home? Things like that. So you can figure out, like, if you know how it works, you can figure out how you can solve problems and how you can help teach it better.
Fabian, do you want to stop sharing so then you can also see us again? Then we can chat more. Perfect.
Yeah. So just one last.
Go on.
No, sorry. No, just wondering, because if, for instance, usually there's, I don't know, I remember from my childhood, there was always kids that were better at maths than others. Could that also maybe help explain why some people are more keen with numbers than others?
Yeah. We're still looking into it, because, like I said, the actual numbers, the symbols that we use, it's completely taught. Like, it doesn't happen automatically, but obviously some kids are better than others, and we're not really sure why. It could be that they're just practicing more at home, that maybe their parents, or they live somewhere where they have siblings that are doing math problems, so they just encounter numbers more than others. We don't know yet, or maybe it's because they're allowed at home to use their hands, and other kids are like, no, you have to don't use your hands, you have to use your head.
It's funny because I have a twin sister and we have the same education, but I was always better at maths than she was. She hated, and was always, because we grew up together, of course, always in the same classes, always. I have to say, from the first grade until the end of high school, she always struggled with maths, and we just had the same education. So I'm actually curious about it. That maybe it's even really something in our brains in these, or I don't know, because it can be definitely, of course, education influence for sure, but also maybe the brain could already, it's interesting.
A couple like innate abilities. Like numbers themselves is completely taught, but for example, spatial reasoning, numbers and space are very much connected. And people who might be innately better at spatial reasoning might also be better at numbers. Again, that's something we don't know yet because we're not sure what we're looking at. But it is a fun thing. So if you, they did this really cool research where they made people walk just randomly, and at certain times they had to yell out a number. And if these were high numbers, these people would walk more often to the right. And if it was low numbers, these people would more often walk to the left. So our brains kind of connect space and numbers as well. So it might be something there as well, where certain kids have different innate abilities that they're just born with that are slightly better. And that kind of translates again to them being better at numbers. And then if you're better at numbers, you're better at math. But yeah, it's a whole rabbit hole.
We have a question from the comments from YouTube. So Taichi asks whether this has been investigated in non-traditional numbering systems. So he was thinking about, for example, the Australian Aboriginal system.
At this point, mostly it's done in Western countries. It's it's a larger problem with weird samples, they call them. But yeah, it's right. There's a lot of different number systems, and the ones that usually are contrasted are the Western way of counting and the Eastern way, where there's just a handful of studies that compare Chinese students to Western students. There's one thing that we find where in Western students, the kids, they have this really small window where they make mistakes in math that are exactly 5 apart from the correct answer. So if the correct answer is 2, they might say 7 or the other way around. So they make what's called the split 5 error more often than other errors. And they figured, well, that might be connected to our hands because 5, like our hands is 2 times 5. And they compared this to a Chinese system where they don't have a difference between 2 hands. When they're counting, they count until 5, and then they continue up until 10 on one hand. They have like special signs up until 10. And there they see that they don't make this split 5 error, or they make them less. So it shows that the way we use our hands with counting or showing numbers, it really affects how our brain processes numbers as well. So there's a few studies, but not a lot, because it hasn't been a popular research field for a while. It's coming up at this point a bit more because it's becoming more important to actually know numbers in our current digital age. So it's becoming more important, and definitely culture is going to be a big influence. There's also cultures that read from, like you have cultures that read from left to right or from right to left, and that also has an influence on how we literally process quantities in the world.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I had maybe one last question. So because before, so I said I count like this, but Margarita said, no, wait, how did you like this, right? So I was wondering, because probably I would now, in a task that you did, I would feel more confident if I saw my representation of 3, and less confident if I saw Margarita's representation. Mm-hmm. But can this change? So let's say I spend a lot of time with Margarita and I keep seeing her representation of 3, her symbol with the hand. Would the brain activity also show this? So at some point, would I also be more confident about her symbol?
I would probably say yes. I haven't found any studies either that compared those number systems that are relatively close, because this and this is still really close. Mm-hmm. And that's also the exact reason why in my study for the non-canonical ones, I didn't use something like this, but I used like a really weird one that's very difficult to do with your fingers, just to make the difference as big as possible. I would say you would get more confident, but you're probably still going to be more comfortable with this one, because that's the one that you use without even thinking.
Yes, true.
Okay.
I think we have another question. We can do one more.
One more and we wrap up. Yeah, it's actually from Maria. Yeah, it's I guess you can also so this it's about the bees that we talked earlier in the talk.
Everyone knows.
It's funny. So they just memorize the maze, or they really know how to count? I don't know if you know this.
It's hard to be sure if they really know how to count, because we cannot ask the bees what they did. But they did alternate between which side was the correct one. And they also changed the numbers up, so it couldn't be that they also memorized what the correct answer was. So they changed up what the correct answer was, they changed up the direction, and the bees were still around 70-ish% of the time correct, which is above chance level, especially if you're a student, then you're going to be happy with a 70%. So it seems that the bees do understand the quantities. If they can count or not, well, that's something you'd have to ask the bees. It's the same problem that we have with babies as well. There's a lot of research we do on babies, but we're not really sure if what's going on is actually going on, because we cannot ask them.
Yeah. Definitely very interesting, I would say. Well, let's thank Fabian and actually applause for this great talk. Yay!
What's fun?
Very interesting, because it's fun to actually realize these things in our daily life with counting. I'm going to remind people that next Monday we are hosting the Women Researchers Festival. It starts at 10, and we hope to see some people there. So I mean, it's going to be this format as well. You are welcome to come. It's going to be nice. For our next event, for Pint of Science Tales, you have to keep tuned on our social media, which is on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Just keep an eye on our updates. Elena and Fabian, would you like to say something before we finish?
No, I just also wanted to say thanks for presenting today, Fabian. I think I never heard about your research this detailed and this well explained, so I'm very happy.
Thank you for having me, and also for the wonderful questions. It was cool.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And thank you also for everybody that watches live or later on YouTube, because it's going to be also available to watch later on if you didn't have the opportunity. Have a nice evening, and prost, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.